Santillano gained a day.
Away, Santillano.
Santillano gained a day.
All on the plains of Mexico.
Mexico,
Oh, Mexico. Away, Santillano.
Mexico
is a place I know. All on the plains of Mexico.
Skipper likes whiskey, the maid likes rum.
Away, Santillano.
The crew likes both, but we can't get none.
All on the plains of Mexico.
Mexico,
oh, Mexico. Away, Santillano.
Mexico
is a place I know. All on the plains of Mexico.
Times is hard and the wages low.
Away, Santillano.
It's time for us to roll and go.
All on the plains of Mexico.
The year is 1846. The United States is a young nation, barely 2 generations old. It is a time of economic and territorial expansion. The spirit of manifest destiny rules the day, and President James K. Polk wants more new territory for the U.S. There is disagreement over the newly annexed territory of Texas, and the United States has just declared war on Mexico. Among the U.S. naval ships blockading the Mexican port of Veracruz is the U.S. brig Somers, a ship with an ominous reputation. An unlucky ship. Some say a cursed ship. December 8, 1846. A Mexican ship attempts to run the blockade. The Somers gives chase. And from nowhere, a gale hits. Suddenly, the Somers is fighting for her life. The U.S. brig Somers, assaulted by the sea, capsized and sank in less than 10 minutes. 2 weeks later in New Orleans, the front page of the Daily Picayune broke the news. Wreck of the U.S. brig Somers, great loss of life. Did this news from the Mexican War at last end the star-crossed history that surrounded the Somers? A history of mutiny and murder, hangings and haunting ghosts, Herman Melville and Billy Budd. It is a story of court-martial and controversy, suicide and disgrace, the founding of the U.S. Naval Academy and of a national college fraternity, an account of bitter war and international cooperation. All of this is the Somers story. And so it was for over 140 years. This tragic ship lay forgotten on the ocean bottom until 1985, when brothers George and Joel Belcher led an expedition to Veracruz in search of the shipwreck of the U.S. brig Somers. In 1846, the brig Somers was assigned to the U.S. Navy's home squadron during the opening months of the Mexican War. The last captain of the Somers was Lieutenant Commander Raphael Sims from Mobile, Alabama. He was destined to become a great hero in the Confederate Navy during the Civil War, but in 1846, he knew only the grim, bitter burden of command.
Sir, it becomes my painful duty to inform you of the loss of the U.S. brig Somers, laid under my command, and the drowning of more than half her crew. The details of this sad catastrophe are briefly as follows. After having been 45 days maintaining the blockade of Veracruz,
in early 1985, George Belcher of San Francisco, a specialist in Mexican art and an underwater explorer, was asked by the government of the state of Veracruz to search for historic shipwrecks around the port of Veracruz. As part of a project to locate historical material for the new Veracruz State Museum, George and Joel Belcher formed a team of divers and technicians. The port of Veracruz became their base of operations. For over 300 years, until Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, Veracruz was the major port in Mexico for the Spanish fleet. The city's long history is dramatized by tales of Spanish conquest, pirate attacks, naval battles, bombardments, and foreign occupation.
I had a special interest in one such episode, the naval blockade, bombardment, and occupation of Veracruz by U.S. forces in 1846 and 1847. In late 1985, I was shown an old map. This map was used for the territorial settlement by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican War. This Mapa de los Estados Unidos de Mexico, issued in 1847, has a small inset. This inset shows a sinking ship with the notation, loss of the U.S. brig Somers, December 8, 1846.
We're all familiar with the story of a treasure map that has an X that marks the spot. But in this case, it's quite true. The old map's really a good map because if you compare it to a modern-day chart, it's quite accurate. The islands and the reefs that surround Veracruz are all shown in their proper positions.
After first seeing this old map, I decided that I needed more information on the Somers sinking. I obtained part of the U.S. Navy's 1846 Court of Inquiry on her loss from the U.S. National Archives, and one of the officers aboard her stated that she sank in 17 fathoms of water, or 102 feet. And if you look at a modern-day chart, the deepest part tends to be where that early inset shows that she went down, almost due west of Isla Verde, or Green Island.
It's one thing to pore over documents, but quite another to actually search for a shipwreck using an old map. The Somers was lost almost a century and a half ago, in deep water in a large ocean. Finding her would not be easy. Using the island Isla Verde as a starting point, the expedition members began the long, arduous task of physically locating the wreck. The Somers carried numerous iron objects, such as ship fittings, anchors, chains, iron cannons, iron balls. The team would use a proton magnetometer towed behind the search boat to detect the magnetic anomalies that the Somers wreckage would create on the ocean floor. Using a fathometer to locate the depth of the area of the sinking, the team streamed with their highly sensitive magnetometer, searching for indications of iron on the wreck. Some anomalies were detected and numerous underwater sites were investigated, but no ship wreckage was found.
We methodically conducted a magnetometer search over a large ocean area for several weeks, and we found nothing. Why hadn't we found the Somers? I could only conclude that the old map's sinking site was inaccurate and that more information was needed. Frustrated, we all returned to the United States. I traveled once again to Washington, D.C. to do more research in the U.S. National Archives, and the more that I read about the Somers' history, the more fascinating her story became.
When I first heard of the Somers Mutiny, it was told to me by my father, who was a naval officer. And he told me the whole story, except that he believed that indeed it was a mutiny. And although I think my father was right on most things, I think he was wrong on this one.
The mid-19th century was a time of change and reorganization for the United States Navy. A serious problem was the training of its future officers and apprentice sailors. There was growing pressure for a real naval school. The Army had established West Point years before, but proponents of the School of the Ship ruled the day. The solution proposed by Commodore Matthew C. Perry, commander of the New York Navy Yard, was to build brigs of war to serve as seagoing schools. The first of these new training ships was the U.S. brig Somers. Launched on April 16, 1842 at the New York Navy Yard, the Somers measured 102 feet overall, 25 feet at the beam, and had a depth of hold of 11 feet. She carried only 10 32-pounder carronade cannons. The Somers hull was protected from the wood-eating Teredo shipworm by copper sheathing.
The Somers was built to be a school ship. She was deliberately designed to be kind of yacht-like, fast, small. She was tiny. Furthermore, she was overmasted and underballasted. She was a top-heavy ship. She was fast. She might indeed have made a good pirate ship if they'd ever started that. But when she got underway, I think they had 120 young sailors on board this tiny, tiny little ship.
New York in 1842 was a bustling maritime city of 300,000 people. The piers along the East River and the Hudson River were crowded with ships and sailors from many nations. After a shakedown cruise to Puerto Rico and back in July, the Somers left the naval shipyard in Brooklyn on the East River, sailing from New York toward Africa on September 13, 1842.
Oh, you New York girls, can't you dance the polka?
The small vessel bulged with the crew of 120. Most were young trainees. 3/4 of the men aboard were 19 years old and younger. 45 members of the crew were between 13 and 16 years of age. Commanding the Somers was Captain Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, Commodore Matthew C. Perry's brother-in-law. The second in command was Lieutenant Gert Gansevoort. Gansevoort's role aboard the Somers would have a dramatic influence on the future writing career of his first cousin, Herman Melville. Captain Mackenzie ran a tight ship. A single-stranded whip, called the Colt, and the cat-o'-nine-tails were the dreaded instruments of punishment. The cat, so named for clawing one's back, was every sailor's nightmare. Herman Melville in White Jacket described the cruel use of the cat. Melville's book is believed to have influenced Congress when it abolished flogging in 1850. Unfortunately, 8 years too late for the crew of the Somers.
The first boatswain's mate advanced, combing out the 9 tails of his cat with his hand, and then, sweeping them round his neck, brought them with the whole force of his body upon the mark. Again, and again, and again. And at every blow, higher and higher rose the long purple bars on the prisoner's back. The keen scourge hissed through the wintry air and fell with a cutting, wiry sound upon the mark.
Captain Mackenzie was noted for his cruelty to the men for small offenses and trifling accidents. On the Somers, 43 separate floggings were logged during the first 3 weeks of the voyage.
It is a statistical fact that 13, 14, 15-year-old boys were flogged 12, 24 times, heavily flogged for what strike us as very minor infractions, and repeatedly flogged for what struck people of that time even as excessive in number. Curiously enough, people who knew Mackenzie in other walks of life, and they were very distinguished often, testified to what a humane, gentle, unassuming, quiet human being he was. And yet, was it a Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing? Once he went out to sea, did he become a kind of a martinet?
The logbook would later disclose that within a period of 6 months on the Somers, Captain Mackenzie ordered 2,265 lashes across the backs of mostly boys. Could such punishment drive a crew to mutiny? Aboard the Somers was 18-year-old Midshipman Philip Spencer. Spencer was the son of then Secretary of War John Canfield Spencer. Young Spencer had a short but notorious naval career of drunken, rebellious behavior and brawls.
The reason he got aboard the Somers was that his father was trying to, quote, make a man of him. And he sent him in the Navy thinking the Navy would straighten him out. Well, of course, just the opposite happened, but that undoubtedly was his father's hope.
There was an ill feeling from the first day between Captain Mackenzie and Midshipman Spencer. Even before Somers sailed, Mackenzie tried unsuccessfully to have Spencer removed from the ship's roster.
I think there was animosity between Mackenzie and Philip Spencer. I think it was very exasperating to Mackenzie to see a man like this, the son of a distinguished cabinet member that had such privileges made available to him, squander them so shamelessly, and be such a fool, as well as it seemed to Mackenzie, surely.
Once at sea, Spencer began to associate freely with the crew and apprentices, spending little time with the officers. He cursed Captain Mackenzie behind his back, calling him a damned old granny and a damned old humbug.
Spencer would do silly things. He had a way, this seemed to annoy Mackenzie extravagantly, he had a way of throwing his jaw out of whack and making songs to amuse the crew. So he would stand there on deck, this officer, as Mackenzie would have seen him, with his mouth askew, making funny sounds.
After 2 months at sea, around 8 in the evening of a moonlit night, Spencer huddled out of sight with James Wales, the purser's steward.
Wales, do you fear death? Are you afraid of a dead man, or of killing a man? Wales, can you keep a secret? Swear that you will, so help you God, swear it.
Spencer then confided a plan for the murder of Captain Mackenzie. The Somers would become a pirate ship. Spencer said about 20 others were in on his plan. The following morning, Wales, shocked by Spencer's words, reported the conversation. Lieutenant Gansevoort informed Captain Mackenzie that a conspiracy existed on board. Midshipman Spencer was at the head of it. With officers assembled on the quarterdeck and all crew forward of the mainmast, Captain Mackenzie approached Midshipman Spencer.
I learn, Mr. Spencer, that you aspire to the command of the Somers.
Oh, no, sir. No, sir.
Did you not tell Mr. Wales, sir, that you had a project to kill the commander, the officers, and a considerable portion of the crew of this vessel and convert her into a pirate?
I may have told them so, sir, but it was in joke.
This, sir, is joking on a forbidden subject. This joke may cost you your life. Arrest Mr. Spencer and put him in double irons.
Boatswain's mate Samuel Cromwell and seaman Elijah Small were also arrested and put in irons on the quarterdeck. Apparently in the grip of a firm belief that his ship was in danger, Captain Mackenzie convened a drumhead court-martial. Drastic measures must be taken. This council of 7 officers, headed by Lieutenant Gansevoort, deliberated all day in the 8 by 10-foot wardroom. Taking testimony from various crew members, the council never once directly questioned the accused mutineers.
So it wasn't until the following morning, December 1st, 1842, that they rendered up their verdict, as it were. Unanimously, they said that the execution had to take place. It was at this point, for the first time, that Spencer and Small and Cromwell learned that they were not going to be returned to the United States, that in fact they were going to be executed within 10 minutes.
Historically, the ship was only a few hundred miles away from St. Thomas, Virgin Islands. It could have put in there. They could have kept them chained up on deck for 2 days and gone into harbor and turned the guys over to the American consul there in irons, if necessary, as prisoners, as accused mutineers, or whatever they wanted to do. But no, Mackenzie, by this time, wanted to hang them. He had the pistol to their head, and he just could not get away from the idea that I'm going to make these 3 guys dead.
Hauling lines called whips were passed over the yardam, 2 on the starboard and 1 on the port. On December 1st, 1842, Midshipman Philip Spencer, boatswain's mate Samuel Cromwell, and seaman Elijah Small stood under the main yardam of the Somers, nooses around their necks. Spencer spoke to Captain Mackenzie.
You may think that I'm not a brave man. You can judge for yourself whether I die like a coward or a brave man.
Here is Spencer standing there. It's a pitiful situation. Here he is standing on a carronade, I believe. And he's all ready with a rope around his neck and a blindfold. And he asked for a few minutes to say his prayers, and then
Spencer asked if he could give the order to fire the cannon, the signal to haul on the ropes. After a long silence, Spencer asked the captain to give the word.
And instantly Mackenzie hollered, "Fire!" They fired the gun, and bingo, it was all over.
Officers watched with pistols cocked as the crew hauled the ropes connected to the 3 hooded men. Their bodies shot skyward through the yardam, dark, ominous, already ghostly figures turning, swaying to the dance of death, a sight that chilled the soul of all aboard the Somers.
Of course, they didn't die instantly. They were not hanged in the way we try to do it, which is to cause instant breaking of the neck and breaking of the spinal cord, which causes you to lose consciousness. They were hauled up, struggling and strangling with the ropes because they were not instantly broken. They were just hauled in the air and strangled. So this was a very difficult death that they went through. And I think it's absolutely unacceptable. There was no court-martial. He had no right to execute people in cold blood without a trial, even.
Captain Mackenzie delivered a pious lecture to the remaining crew members, many of whom were weeping. The crew was ordered to give 3 cheers for the American flag and then pipe down to dinner, while the bodies were left to swing above them in the wind. After dinner, the bodies were elaborately prepared for burial. At dusk, they were ceremoniously lowered into the sea. Many years later, Herman Melville would end his last novel with these words:
I remember Taff the Welshman when he sank, and his cheek it was like the budding pink. But me they'll lash in hammock, drop me deep, fathoms down, how I'll dream fast asleep. I feel it stealing now. Sentry, are you there? Just ease these darbies at the wrist and roll me over fair. I am sleepy, and the oozy weeds about me twist.
Influenced by his cousin's role as second in command of the Somers, Melville's intimate connection with the Somers story would produce one of the author's finest novels, second only to his great Moby Dick. In May 1888, an article, The Mutiny of the Somers by Lieutenant H.D. Smith, appeared in the American magazine. This revival of interest in the Somers Mutiny controversy seems to have stirred the imagination of Herman Melville, now in his winter years. In November 1888, Melville began writing a new story. Seated at his writing desk at home in New York City, he finally concluded the manuscript of a new novel with End of Book, April 19th, 1891. When America's great novelist died only 5 months later, this manuscript was stored away in an old tin bread box. 30 years after his death, Melville's final novel was discovered by the scholar Raymond Weaver. This masterpiece, Billy Budd, told the story of a young sailor who was falsely accused of mutiny and was tried and convicted and hanged from the yardarm. Unjustly executed, Billy's spirit and his legend lived on in the minds of his fellow sailors. They began to believe that the yardarm from which Billy Budd was hanged was sacred. As Melville wrote, to sailors, a chip of it was as a piece of the cross. Like Billy Budd, the spirit and legend of Midshipman Philip Spencer lives on today in Chi Psi, the National Collegiate Fraternity.
Here's Philip Spencer who went about to die. When sinking down beneath the waves, I shouted out, Chi Psi!
Though he didn't do much with his schoolwork, he did manage to found a fraternity, the Chi Psi fraternity, at Union, Schenectady, New York, that continues to be a very successful national fraternity. Of course, they think very well of Philip Spencer, the founder of their group, their fraternity. They think he was unjustly punished, and it's hard for me to believe he deserved to hang.
Oh, here's to Philip Spencer.
Spencer was described by contemporaries as a talented young man, very quick to learn. He mastered Greek and Latin, played the violin fairly well, and spoke good Spanish. He was a great reader of sea stories, especially about pirates. He took great delight in the initiations, grips, signs, and passwords of the secret fraternity he helped found, always trying to make them more mysterious and impressive.
Spencer obviously had some kind of an imagination. He clearly was unfit for naval service. He was probably unfit for most civilian pursuits. But he did have an imagination. He had an education. He might conceivably have become a writer, might have been even a successful, good writer. And what happened to him, of course, was tragic. He was cut off at the beginning of his life, really.
Chi Psi members believe that Philip Spencer, the martyred hero of their fraternity, was murdered aboard the Somers, killed because he would not reveal what may have been fraternity secrets written in Greek inscriptions found among his papers. These inscriptions were used as evidence against him for mutiny, for they supposedly listed Spencer's co-mutineers and those who would be killed if the mutiny had taken place. The strong circle of friendship among Chi Psi members that resulted from Spencer's death is believed to have helped the fraternity grow in the 19th century. Honored as a founder, Philip Spencer's portrait still hangs in the Union College Library.
So fill your glasses to the brim and drink with manly pride. Humanity received a blow and Philip Spencer died.
The Somers Mutiny affair became a scandal that rocked the young United States. Never before had there been a hanging in the U.S. Navy. Publicity was certain, for Captain Mackenzie had just hanged the son of the Secretary of War. In early 1843, Nathaniel Currier, founder of the famous lithography house of Currier and Ives, issued this lithograph showing the men hanging on the Somers. One question would not go away. Was Captain Mackenzie guilty of the murder of young Midshipman Spencer and the two other hanged men?
The Navy hastily called a general court-martial. Mackenzie was given long opportunities to justify his action, and of course he generated sympathy because all the naval officers had had occasions when they had difficulty with their crews, and of course, in effect, the naval club closed around him.
In this highly publicized court-martial aboard the USS North Carolina, Mackenzie, charged with murder, was cleared just barely. Not proven was the verdict. Until the assassination of President Lincoln, no trial would shock the American public more. Could there have been a cover-up? Did the Navy protect one of its own? Captain Mackenzie was a member of an influential Navy family. Two of the officers from the Somers who testified at the trial were his nephews, the sons of Mackenzie's brother-in-law, Commodore Matthew C. Perry.
My personal opinions about whether there really was a mutiny would probably come down to this. I don't doubt for a minute that Philip Spencer was a very unhappy young man. I think he was just a misguided, romantic kid, a punk, if you will, discontented, daydreaming, talking too much, sounding off. I think he had to have been called on it. But I can't imagine the necessity of hanging him. I can't imagine that the mutiny could ever have materialized.
The mutiny on the Somers, as far as I'm concerned, never existed. It was commented on as the mutiny on the Somers. It was so called by the press for want of some other quick title to give it. But it was not a mutiny. No mutiny was ever attempted. It was a figment of the imagination of a captain who himself was probably not fully rational. And he, in effect, committed murder. So it was murder on the high seas. And that's my evaluation of it.
Guilt and misfortune seem to have plagued the officers involved in the Somers Mutiny affair. The ship's surgeon, 28-year-old Richard Leacock, committed suicide, shooting himself aboard the Somers 3 days after Captain Mackenzie was acquitted. The second-in-command, Gert Gansevoort, took to drink and died in 1868, described as a sad wreck of his former self, always moody, taciturn, and restless. Captain Mackenzie would live only 6 more years. He died at age 45 of a heart attack, often haunted until his death by the ugly rumors of his role on the Somers. And the Somers? The hangings gave her a bad name. She was a cursed ship, and no one wanted to serve on her. The one who did serve aboard her, Midshipman Robert Rogers, later wrote in his memoirs the warning of his shipmates when he was transferred to the Somers.
My fellow mates consoled me on a change so regrettable and inauspicious. Goodbye, and God bless you, my boy. Get rid of that craft as soon as you can, for sooner or later she's bound to go to the devil. Since the mutiny, damn bad luck goes with her.
Sailors claimed that the hanged men haunted the Somers. Time after time there were sightings of ghostly figures in the shrouds and rigging. And at night, voices were heard, crying out above the yardings. The scandal over the hangings grew so great that the Secretary of the Navy founded a school to train future officers and prevent any repetition of the Somers Mutiny. Thus began the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, an honorable legacy of the Somers affair. But in the 19th century, the Somers Mutiny was such an embarrassment to the Navy that it was a point of honor among officers never to discuss the matter. When the Somers sank, many hoped that the scandal would sink to the bottom of the ocean with her. When he returned to the National Archives, George Belcher discovered Lieutenant Commander Semmes' description of the Somers tragedy.
Lieutenant Parker, second in command, remarked to me that it looked a little squally to windward. Lieutenant Parker took the mainsail off her and had got the spanker about half-brailed when the squall struck us. The brig being flying light, she was thrown over almost instantly. When she was on the point of sinking beneath us, I gave the order, "Every man save himself who can."
Minutes before, the crew had managed to drop the portside lifeboat, and Commander Sims had ordered it to carry crew members to nearby Isla Verde, or Green Island. In his Naval Court of Inquiry testimony, Lieutenant James Parker described exactly where the Somers sank. George had finally found the vital information he was seeking.
Lieutenant Commander Sims ordered us to land the men on Green Island and to return. Green Island bearing about east and distant about 1 mile. We were at this time in about 17 fathoms of water.
With this new information, I now knew that we would finally find the Somers. And at some point, all of the history that I had been learning about the Somers, from books and documents and records, began to come alive. The Somers had been a real ship, crewed by real men, many of whom had died when she died.
Out of 76 officers and crew, 32 drowned. 7 were captured ashore by the Mexicans. Raphael Sims and Lieutenant Parker, both good swimmers, survived by hanging on to a floating arms chest grating. The London Illustrated News, in an article on January 23, 1847, reported that some were driven to sea to be heard of no more, and others encountered the worst fate that could be imagined in being devoured by sharks. Foreign warships, English, French, and Spanish, anchored nearby at Sacrificios Island to observe the war, came to the rescue, saving many members of the Somers crew. This lithograph from 1847 shows one of the French brig Mercure's lifeboats in heavy seas, rescuing survivors from the Somers. 2 midshipmen who drowned on the ill-fated Somers, Henry Clemson and John Hinson, were commemorated in 1848 when this monument was erected at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. In May 1986, the Belcher team returned to Veracruz. Strong winds called El Norte, the same annual winds that sank Somers 140 years before, constantly blew for 2 weeks. Unable to go to sea, team members began to joke that they were also victims of the Somers curse. In spite of the weather, they finally returned to Isla Verde, repeating the same search pattern, but this time adding weights to run the magnetometer line deeper. On June 2nd, the magnetometer registered an anomaly in 110 feet of water, indicating a concentration of iron objects. George and Joel prepared to dive. Ironically, the new research had led them back to the same area they had explored months before. Had they finally found the Somers?
We swam down into a murky green sea that got darker and darker the deeper we went. It was like swimming into a tunnel. It was oppressive. But the strange thing was that when we got almost to the bottom, where I thought it would be darkest of all, there was a kind of glow. The sand was picking up what little light had made it down that far and reflecting it back. And in the heart of that ghostly glow were the half-buried bones of the Somers. We had come down right on top of her.
Diving into this tomb of time, George and Joel swam the length of the wreck. Everything that the Somers carried aboard her then lay on the bottom now. Scattered about were numerous encrusted cannons. They found intact ceramic vessels and glass bottles. They discovered a large anchor off the starboard bow. Hundreds of unidentifiable encrusted objects lay in the hull of this lost ship. This was the tragic Somers, and no one had seen her in almost a century and a half. Hoping to keep their discovery a secret from local fishermen and divers who might pilfer the wreck, George and Joel made only one dive on the Somers. They would wait 5 months before returning to the site.
Joel and I returned to Veracruz in late 1986 with underwater cameraman Marty Snyderman to document the shipwreck. During our dives on the Somers, strange things began to happen. We had often talked about the Somers' reputation as a cursed ship, as a haunted ship, but suddenly when the weather would turn unusual at the strangest times, or a diver would come from 110 feet below and claim that he heard voices, or that he saw something standing on the bottom, well, we all began to consider the story of the Somers ghost and her curse a little more seriously.
Intellectually, it's easy to dismiss the stories as pure legend. But when you dive on this shipwreck, the visibility is limited and the water takes on this spooky diaphanous quality. Marty's assistant, Chip Matherson, is a veteran diver, came up from a dive on the shipwreck and yelled, "Okay, who's the joker who was yelling at me down there?" We looked around at each other because Chip had been diving on the wreck by himself.
In fact, Midshipman Robert Rogers transferred to the Somers shortly before she was lost off Veracruz, described in his memoirs published in 1890 how during a storm at night he had climbed high in the rigging of the Somers to find out why his main topmen were not lowering sail. He found them huddled in the lee of the mainmast. Rogers asked the captain of the top why no one was reefing the sails.
Amid that awful din, I scarce heard his reply, but followed his finger pointing to the weather yardam. "I see nothing," I yelled. "Spencer and Small," he bawled. "Don't you see 'em?" I peered through the darkness as I recalled the people of that tragedy. My very fears did really for a moment persuade me that I saw Spencer's ghost. The next day, I encountered the captain of the top, and in answer to my ridicule of his fears, he quietly said, "All right, sir, all right. There are things you gentlemen abaft the mainmast don't see, and if you did, you wouldn't laugh at them. But mark my words, the brig's doomed. We'll never see port again, and a good many of us will go down with her."
2 weeks later, on a stormy morning, the Somers heeled over in a sudden gale. The dire prediction proved tragically true.
In early 1987, a friend, Dr. Mitch Markin, introduced me to Jim Delgado, who was then the chief maritime historian for the U.S. National Park Service. Both Mitch and Jim were shipwreck archaeologists, and I invited them with me down to Veracruz to dive on the Somers shipwreck.
Appear on the bottom. What we're going to do, though, and what I'd like to concentrate on.
After we got to Veracruz, I was really quite eager to hear about their first dive on the Somers shipwreck. How'd it go?
Fantastic.
That's a terrific wreck, isn't it?
It sure is. It just lays there right below you. There.
Oh yeah, there's some great stuff.
Woo. What do you think? Well, the Somers?
There's no doubt in my mind.
All right.
I tell you, George, you drop down there, and what you got that you think is maybe a bowsprit really is the sheathing for the stem post at the bow. And what's happened is it's rotted, and the worms have gotten in and eaten the wood. So that sheathing is sort of folded over and twisted around. So it looks sort of like it could be, but
Yeah, that's what we had thought initially.
Yeah.
It's been over the stem post.
now when we swam back, we did get to the stern post.
Yeah.
The lines of that hull are so sharp.
So that's a definite. Great.
You can really see the Baltimore Clipper style of the Somers in the lines that you see on the bottom.
Jim got 100 feet from stem to stern.
She was 102 feet.
There's a.
Well, we got 100.5.
Okay.
100 feet 5 inches.
Okay, that's where we run it. And then there's another 2 feet left where the rudder is, and it's
Yes.
beautifully visible. You can just see her sitting there. So the line's actually tied to the rudder post.
Yeah, the rudder is sort of dropped off and it's heeled over to starboard. But you can see it there. And what's interesting, did you notice all the wood had been eaten out of the stern post?
Yeah.
So it's like a fragile, it's like a ghost of what was once there.
Like I said,
All
the skeleton of the ship, everything that was encased to protect her from the worms, initially as she was sailed, has lost. The worms have won.
The sheathing really sort of preserves the outlines of the timber that was once there. It really is a ghost ship sitting there. I mean, you can see the outlines, everything. All sorts of stuff is falling in on the bottom. We saw the steering mechanism, the tiller. We saw lots of anchor cable, chain, really. There's guns, maybe 4 or 5 cannon. We saw the pumping mechanism. We saw the galley stove.
Diving was limited again because of bad weather, but Jim Delgado was able to positively identify the wreck as the U.S. brig Somers. During these dives, Dr. Markin completed a preliminary archaeological survey of the shipwreck. His survey resulted in an initial mapping of the Somers site.
The wreck is an archaeologist's dream because so much of her structure is still there, and it's a ship of historic importance lying undisturbed on the seabed for almost 150 years, with her cannons and equipment in disarray but apparently intact. The wreck is in 103 to 107 feet of water off Isla Verde. She lies on her starboard side on a slightly silty sand bottom. Her wooden upperworks have been eaten by marine organisms, leaving the outline of her hull preserved by the copper sheathing. The interior of the Somers wreck is literally filled with thousands of artifacts and rigging components. 2 anchors are visible off the port and starboard bow. Throughout the wreck are rows and rows of spikes that have fallen neatly on top of each other and are stacked just inside the copper sheathing. Running from bow to stern are a concentration of ceramics and ship fittings, the galley stove, the windlass, and rows of stowed chain. Six of the 10 32-pounder carronade cannons have been located so far. This is a 32-pounder cannon and its carriage after almost 150 years on the seabed. This shows how these cannons would have looked in their original condition. Many once new articles are now so heavily encrusted with marine growth that a trained eye is required to recognize what they once were. The ship's pump assembly and steering gear were also identified, and a beautifully preserved chronometer was discovered near the stern. It is highly likely that a large portion of the Somers hull lies in the sand, and highly probable that an enormous quantity of wreck material lies under the silt off the starboard side.
Today, the world learned exactly where the Somers went down.
When the team returned to the United States, the discovery of the Somers was announced at a press conference in San Francisco.
It mentioned that sooner or later she was doomed to go to the
Eager to protect the shipwreck to ensure scientific study of the Somers, George, with Jim Delgado's assistance, enlisted the help of a fellow ex-Peace Corps friend, Ambassador Robert Gelbard of the State Department. In a flurry of diplomatic notes between the U.S. State Department and Mexico, the United States proposed a cooperative approach to work on the Somers, but informed Mexico that the Somers shipwreck was considered U.S. property and a war grave under provision of international law and convention.
Under international law, ships that are warships are essentially the sovereign territory of the nation whose flag they fly. What that means is that the Somers, as a U.S. warship, was part of the United States afloat. And even though she sank, she still remains part of the United States to this day. So the United States has been pursuing with the Somers, as it has with France and with other nations, to recognize that fact and to have the United States get its title back to the wreck of the Somers.
On March 9, 1847, in one of the most daring and successful amphibious operations in U.S. military history, more than 10,000 American troops were landed ashore south of the walled city of Veracruz. When a U.S. naval battery was set up using cannons taken off American warships, both former commanders of the Somers, Mackenzie and Sims, were in command of 32-pound guns as this naval battery bombarded the walls of the city. The United States Army marched and fought on toward Mexico's capital in the final bloody battles of Churubusco, Molina del Rey, Chapultepec, and finally the assault on Mexico City itself.
The Mexican War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848, was a particularly bitter war. It's a war that, for Mexicans, was the war of North American aggression, or the first intervention by the United States. In Mexican history, we find that the Mexicans have consistently been victims of foreign invasions and incursions and foreign adventures. And more galling to the Mexicans, I think, are the few times that they have faced the brunt of an American thrust into Mexico.
General Ulysses S. Grant, a young lieutenant during the Mexican War, would later call the U.S. invasion of Mexico the most unjust war ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. As the Mexican proverb says, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. The American flag would fly above Mexico's national palace, the halls of Montezuma, for 9 months during the American occupation of Mexico City. On March 10, 1848, the U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican War. In the peace settlement that followed, the United States paid $15 million to Mexico for the territory that Mexico ceded to the U.S., land that would become Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, Utah, and significant parts of Wyoming and Colorado. Mexico would lose half of her territory. For Mexico, it was a bitter and costly defeat. In July 1990, the Somers became the occasion for historical U.S.-Mexico cooperation in Veracruz, setting aside legal questions of ownership, and despite the sensitivity of a bitter war, the U.S. and Mexico organized the first joint government underwater archaeological expedition ever undertaken in the Americas. A team of Mexican Navy officers and divers, led by Captain Santos Gomez Leyva, provided support and logistics as part of the international team. A U.S. National Park Service team led by Jim Delgado joined a Mexican team of underwater archaeologists led by Dr. Pilar Luna of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History. George and Joel Belcher joined the expedition and directed the international team to the Somers site.
With all of this history, and with monuments throughout Veracruz talking about the heroic defenders who died under American guns, it was all the more significant, and I think all the more touching, that we actually were able to work proactively with the Mexicans on a ship that, for many of them, epitomized this conflict. So it was a touching moment, and a rather significant one, to be working on the project and to be diving on the wreck of the U.S. brig Somers off of a Mexican patrol boat with the Mexican flag fluttering overhead.
Each dive day included 35mm color photography, videotaping with voice-recorded observations, and surveying of the site using baseline trilateration.
The cannons and the pump and the hose pipes and stuff, I put the ruler in the picture so you have some idea of scale.
John Brooks, the U.S. National Park Service's underwater photographer, captured these images of the Somers in the limited visibility 107 feet below. Jim Delgado and Dr. Luna probed one of the 32-pound carronade cannons and discovered that it was loaded and ready to fire when the Somers capsized. They also discovered a fine porcelain dinner plate that Lieutenant Commander Semmes may have eaten from the night before the Somers was lost.
We got the baseline down.
U.S. National Park Service archaeologists Larry Nordby and Jerry Livingston surveyed the shipwreck. They eventually produced a detailed map of the Somers site. Jim Delgado, wearing a full-face mask that connects to his video camera, was able to assist the mapping of the site by describing his observations while diving on the Somers and videotaping her wreckage.
Coming up on the muzzle of a second 32-pound carronade. You can see the carriage moving past it now, down to the stern of the ship. And here is the rudder, which is heeled over to starboard. You get a good idea of the angle at which the ship lies. More or less on its starboard side here, as I swing alongside.
Studying ships of war is a unique and fascinating part of underwater archaeology. It gives you a chance to look at intensely focused moments in which people are literally sailing out to fight, perhaps to die. Looking at ships of war like the Somers is important because we have written records that tell us something about the ship, but the archaeological record will tell us more. It's important to take a look down there at the bottom at the Somers. Lying on her side with everything exactly where it should be, we can look at the rig. We can determine from the surviving documents and plans and what we see down there a bit more about the story of the ship, and by doing so, a little bit more about the United States at a time when it was truly coming into its own as an international power.
The United States and Mexico successfully completed their first joint inspection dive on the Somers. Both countries met again in Mexico City, and plans are in progress for a more detailed scientific study of the shipwreck in the future.
Our discovery of the Somers has revived an infamous, perhaps shameful, but important story of America's history. For me, it's been a 7-year obsession that's finally come to a successful conclusion. The discovery has brought two nations together to study a ship lost in a bloody war between them. Hopefully, both nations will continue to work together to study and protect the wreck. It has been suggested that the Somers shipwreck site should eventually become a marine sanctuary. If so, other divers will have the same opportunity that we have had to dive on the shipwreck and to relive and to experience, for a short while, the story of the brig Somers.
George and Joel Belcher's discovery of this unique shipwreck in the Gulf of Mexico is the beginning of yet another chapter in the 150-year-old Somers story that touches the psyche of America and the heritage of two nations. A new chapter that is a fresh look at the long, controversial Somers Mutiny affair, an episode in U.S. history that lives on today in Herman Melville's Billy Budd, in the spirit of the Chi Psi fraternity's Philip Spencer, and in the daily activities of the U.S. Naval Academy. And perhaps George and Joel's discovery finally ends, once and for all, the curse of the Somers.
Come listen all ye sailors bold, come listen unto me. I'll sing you of a cruel deed, a bloody tragedy. Come listen, landsmen, one and all, come listen unto me. I'll make you bless your lucky stars you've never gone to sea. It was the Somers, graceful, swift, as trim a little brig, as e'er was modelled by shipwright, or sailors helped to rig. The gratings rigged, the hangman's whip dangles from main-yard arm. The wondering crew gaze on the sight with terror and alarm. And ill luck and misfortune dire will follow in thy wake, till the ghastly three where lie their bones thy last dark haven make. Sheet home on every cursed spar, set every rag of sail, and leave here to the ocean ghouls and demons of the gale. Oh, here's to Philip Spencer, who when about to die when sinking down beneath the waves loud shouted out Kai-Sai. So fill your glasses to the brim and drink with manly pride. Humanity received a blow and Philip Spencer died. Oh, here's to those of greater fame, martyrs of Alpha Psi. They loved the name, they died in flame, they rescued their Kai-Sai. So fill your glasses to the brim and drink with manly pride. Humanity received a blow and Philip Spencer died. Fill every breaker up, my boys, with rosy wine filled high. For now we drink to thee and thine, let's drink to old Kai-Sai. So fill your glasses to the brim and drink with manly pride. Humanity received a blow and Philip Spencer died. And when our feast is ended and stars are in the sky, we'll all go tumbling off to bed, each jolly old Kai-Sai. So fill your glasses to the brim and drink with manly pride. Humanity received a blow and Philip Spencer died.